Okay, we're going to jump right into what we want to know about anatomy. First thing we need to think about in comparative anatomy. What we want to know about anatomy. First of all, we know that everything has a name. All the parts that we talk about, we'll want to identify with a name. So we'll want to know the names, and that's what most people think of, first of all, when you talk about studying anatomy, is associating names with parts. Next, regarding the anatomical parts, we want to know basically the position and overall structure of whatever part we're dealing with. So that's the second thing. Next, we'll know a little bit about tissue composition. This we also know as the histology of the part or the anatomical structure we're dealing with, tissue composition. We'll also want to deal with developmental origins. This is embryology, how from the embryo we get whatever organs and tissues we want to study in anatomy. We'll also want to identify some basic function, why the part is there, the anatomical utility of whatever we're looking at. And since this is comparative anatomy, we're going to look at variation between one species and another, the comparative look. So comparing fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and so anyway, these are things we need to know about anatomy. The overall study of anatomy in biology should include these things: knowing the names, position and structure, tissue composition, developmental origins, basic functions, and what kind of variation there might be in the different forms. Now, you might be wondering why we have different courses in anatomy. We teach a human anatomy course, and we also teach this comparative anatomy course. Human anatomy course does not go as much into the basic biology, the broader understanding of anatomy, like we do in comparative anatomy. So, why comparative is our next topic. Just a little explanation of why this course is very useful. First of all, we get a greater context, greater frame of context. Regarding anatomy. And so we have, really this is a biologist kind of approach to anatomy. Gives you a greater frame of context. We'll look at the structure in a lot of different ways. We'll have more background information on where anatomy comes from and so on. So we have a greater frame of context in the overall biology of organisms. Next, what we call logical progression. Logical progression. So we can look at simpler forms and then compare them to more complex forms of organisms and so on. So we kind of have this building of anatomy from the basic, smaller initial forms that we'll look at in here, and then we'll see how the different groups have more parts, and some groups have one type of part and other groups have another kind of expression of the part. So we see this logical progression in the different animal groups as we look through all the chordate animals. Next, comprehensive. Comprehensive. This means that we're going to learn enough information about anatomy that we'll be able to apply it to all kinds of chordate organisms. We'll see the anatomy of lampreys and sharks and cats and different organisms as we go through. And you go to any other organism, any other kind of reptile, you can open it up and have a basic understanding of what part is what part. There's a consistency, and so we'll have a comprehensive knowledge of the anatomy of chordate animals. And then finally, we have just a broader framework of knowledge when we're all through. We'll have a better understanding of anatomy as it connects to embryology, as it connects to maybe physiology and the ecological needs of an organism and so on. So we have a greater framework of knowledge. We're better biologists. We know more about the biology of the organisms in the end, which you don't get if you do a simple human anatomy course and you just identify parts. So this is why we have a comparative anatomy course, a more essential course for those that might be going into teaching. Often this is suggested for medical students rather than human anatomy because the broader biological knowledge is more important. They will teach you the more detailed anatomy in anatomy courses in medical school and some other professional programs, so that this forms a better foundation on which they can build and teach you more about anatomy. So that's why we have a comparative anatomy course. Okay, we've already talked about, identified some things that anatomy students are supposed to learn as they study anatomy. We made the case for doing a comparative anatomy course and why that's beneficial to make you a better biologist. Now we're going to talk about just kind of an overview of the course of comparative anatomy. So this is a little bit of where we are going. The upcoming sequence of events for comparative anatomy. First of all, this is mainly about chordate, the phylum Chordata, but we're going to talk just briefly about how chordates compare to other kinds of animals. Other taxa or groups of animals. So next thing, we'll identify the primary chordate subphylum. There are 3 chordate subphyla, and we'll talk about each of those. We'll make an outline of the entire group. So this is all about chordates, just talking about chordates in general, those 2 topics. Next we'll talk a little bit about what we call phylogeny. This is how we group organisms based on similarities, and differences. The grouping of them, like we know what cats are, we know what seals are, we know what whales are. So those are things that have similarities. We put them into a group, and then we can kind of compare groups. So we know there's a dog group, there's a cat group, there are bears. All those things are included as carnivores, for example. So that's how we group things. Next, we're going to talk some about evolutionary theory. We'll spend quite a bit of time on that general concept. It's a good place to get a good foundation of understanding of where that evolutionary theory comes from as you study comparative anatomy. Next, we'll do kind of a meet the players is what I call it. It's an overview of all the different kinds of mainly vertebrate organisms, but we'll talk about some of the other lesser taxa as well as we go through that. We'll get more of a detailed understanding of all the vertebrate groups as we go through meet the players and talk about the characteristics that are used in the constructing of the family trees or phylogenies for these. We'll also talk about embryology. So we'll get an understanding of where organs come from in the first place, the embryology of the organism. And there's a lot to know about this. It'll be a challenging part of what we do. Next, we'll deal with basic tissues As I mentioned before, that's histology, the studying of the tissues, basic tissue study. And then we'll go through system by system, looking at the different body systems. Starting with the integument and talking about the skeletal system, the digestive and respiratory system, circulatory, urinary, reproductive, do all the different systems of the body, and then we'll do each of those beginning as a human study, looking at the human structure, and then we'll go back and we'll look at the other taxa and how their structures are similar or different to what we talked about with human anatomy. So that's how we're going to approach the comparative component of anatomy. Start with humans and then go back and look at the other taxa compared to humans. This first section will take quite a bit of time. We should have more than half the semester to do that system by system study when it's all done.